queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew the law and the judgment. Verse 15, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law? Because he had not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. And then he gets advice down to verse 19, please. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And we trust the Lord to bless the word that we've read together. The book of Esther. The book is one of suffering and glory. A book of ups and downs. Here we have a young, orphan Jewish girl. And she became the queen of all Persia. You have Mordecai, on the other hand, who was a part of a hated race, just to become the prime minister of all of Persia. This man was to be hung. Then there was the mighty Ahasuerus, who was exposed for his weakness. There was the Jews, about to be wiped out completely as a nation in the Persian Empire, and they were miraculously preserved. In this book we see the dethronement of Vashti and the enthronement of Esther. We see the promotion and the demotion of Haman. And we see the demotion and the promotion of Mordecai and the Jews. Ups and downs, suffering and glory. One of the most important lessons is that God was in control. God controlled the narrative right from beginning to the end, as He rules not only over men, but over all the affairs of men. In this respect, I want you to please notice the emphasis on the number 7 in chapters 1 and 2. In verse 5, it speaks of the second banquet. It went on for 7 days. In verse 10, we have the 7th day and 7 chamberlains. Verse 14, 7 princes and wise men. Chapter 2, verse 9, 7 maidens. Chapter 2, verse 16, the 7th year of the king's reign. The number 7, which has the symbolic meaning of completeness and perfection, is frequently used in the book of Esther. For the Jews, this is the number associated with God. It may not have meant much to the Persians, but it was of great significance to the Jews. There are many things in the believer's life and in the assembly life that seem insignificant, that seems common to the world, but it might be of the greatest significance to the believer, to the child of God. As we come to understand God's ways and God's works and God's will and God's purposes. The world rejects the Word of God. It rejects the promises of God and the predictions of the Bible. It rejects circumstances as just chance. But things don't just happen. Not in the life of the believer. When I gave the introduction to Esther this morning, we have noticed what someone said about providence. It is the hand of God in the glove of human events. Nothing happens by chance for the believer. Providence is the hand of God and the glove of human events. My brother and sister, God is always on the throne in heaven. It's a sure throne. Even when we think that things are out of control, the chorus says, God is still on the throne and He will remember His own. And therefore we can rejoice and we can find great comfort in the fact that God's hands of providence is upon us. And God is in control of the narratives of our lives. We've noticed that the book divides into 3 sections. Chapter 1 and 2, the feasts of the king. Chapter 3 to 8, the feasts of the queen. And then in chapter 9 and 10, the feasts of the Jews. Something I might add at this stage is, when you look at the first section, the feast of the king, you will find that it involves 2 women and 2 feasts. In the second section, the feasts of the queen, that involves 2 men and 2 feasts. And when you come to the last section, chapter 9 and 10, the feast of the Jews, it involves 2 letters and 2 feasts. For our session this afternoon, we will look at chapter 1, the first feast of the king. We get to look into the first 6 months the Bible presents of this man's life. Chapter 1 itself divides into 3 logical sections. In verses 1 to 9, we'll notice there's a great party, a great feast. In chapter 10 to 18, it leads to a great problem, a great predicament. And as a result of the problem and predicament, verses 19 to 22, the king allowed others to make a judgment, and they came up with a great plan. So there's the great party that led to a great problem, and that led to the birth of a grand plan. So first notice verses 1 to 9, the great party or the great feast. This opening section gives us the historical setting for the book of Esther. It tells us where it took place, it tells us when it took place, and it introduces us to 2 main characters of this book: Ahasuerus and Queen Vashti. This chapter introduces us and prepares us for the rise of Esther by indicating why Vashti was deposed. It also introduces us to the theme of wealth and a royal power that you will find throughout the book from chapter 1 to chapter 10. And so verse 1 starts, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus." This expression set the stage for chapter 1. It says, "This Ahasuerus, which reigned from India unto Ethiopia." It even intends to identify Ahasuerus more distinctly. It is this particular man. He reigned over more than half of the then world. From Russia to the north to Africa in the south. From India in the east to Europe in the west. What a vast empire. He ruled over 127 provinces. Ahasuerus was the king. The king, not the king's name, but a title. Just like the pharaohs were titles and the Caesars were titles, Ahasuerus was a title of this king, of this empire. He was known in history by his real name, Xerxes I. And we are immediately introduced to the greatness of this power, the dominion and the power of this king, controlling more than half of the world. In view of this, in view of his power and his influence, you can imagine the great danger that Mordecai and Esther found themselves in, working against the will and the plans and the ways of this mighty king. Verse 2, that in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace. It simply means that he was in residence at the palace in Shushan. Now the Babylonian or the Persian Empire usually had 4 capitals. Shushan was the winter capital of the Persian Empire. So it was winter time when these events took place. It was both the name of the capital city and the royal palace. His father, King Darius, some years ago, enlarged the city, and he beautified the city with the most magnificent palace. And the Greek historian or philosopher Aristotle says, this is a wonderful royal palace, shining with gold and amber and ivory. Even Aristotle was impressed with just the wealth and the magnificence of this particular palace. It's here that the party took place. When we come to verse 3 and 4, we come to the actual party, the actual feast. You see, for the majority of people in the Persian Empire, life was hard. Food was scarce. Laborers received barely enough to live on. And yet they produced the most beautiful of artworks over the years. However, life in the palace, you can imagine, life in the palace was extravagant beyond imagination. All the things that were on display, the king made a great display of his power, of his majesty, of his glory, of his wealth, to which he invited the elite of the empire. So I want you to notice a few things about this party. It was excessive in its prosperity. Excessive in its prosperity. We read that in verse 4. He showed the riches of his glorious kingdom. Literally, he showed the dazzling wealth of his kingdom. What a display of wealth and prosperity and abundance. It was excessive in its prosperity. That's in verse 4. Verse 3, you'll notice it was excessive in terms of its participants. Verse 3 says, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces, that's the elite, being before him. That means they were gathered unto the king. Oh, unlike the gathering unto the greatest king of Israel ever, King David. 1 Samuel chapter 22 verse 2 says of David, and everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves unto David. Here, it was not the discontented and the poor and the strugglers. It was the elite of the country gathered unto the king of the country. How unlike the gathering unto the ultimate King of God, as we've done this morning. What an honor it was to be before him, not because we are the elite of this world, but because we are sinners saved by grace. It was excessive in terms of his participants. Verse 4 again, it was excessive in terms of its period, its duration. Verse 4 tells us that this went on for 180 days, for 6 months. The fact that he could entertain them for so long was a proof of his greatness and his wealth and his riches and his resources. He inherited from his father unprecedented health, wealth, and gold in plenty and luxurious goods. This man had it made. To have a party for 180 days, for 6 months, it's quite a feat. magnificent long feasts were quite popular in the Persian courts, and it's well documented in history. The whole point for this, for the 6-month-long feast in verse 4, it's to show the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty. It was all about him. Think of the arrogance of this man, how entitled he was. So when we come to verse 5, we come to the end of this feast, the end of the 6 months feast, and this was not enough for the man. He's going to have another feast for another 7 days. At the end of these days, a specific feast that lasted for 7 days was added to the 6 months. But those who were invited was different now. Not now only the elite of the empire, but also the lower classes, the servants, the common people, as shown by the phrase, both unto great and small, from the highest to the lowest, the important and the unimportant, the rich and the poor, from the least to the greatest. This banquet was all-inclusive. Considering the duration of this feast and the all-inclusiveness of this feast, it is clear that there was no threat to the kingdom from the outside. It was a time of peace. It was a time of blessing. It was a time of great benefit and fruitfulness for all the people in Persia, except for the people of God. No wealth for the people of God. No blessings for the people of God. No benefits for the people of God. This was the case in Esther's time, and is still generally the case in our time. And so we wonder at the prosperity of the wicked compared with the experience of the godly. You know, the psalmist was just as puzzled and confused, and he lamented the situation. He lamented over the injustice that he noted and that he observed in this world. The people of God struggled. The wicked seemed to prosper. We read in Psalm 73 verse 12. This is what the psalmist says. Behold, these are the ungodly who prosper in the world. They increase in riches. It was a concern to him. He says in verse 16, when I thought to know this, it was too painful for me. However, the psalmist looked up. He looked to God, and God gave him a heavenly perspective. He said to the psalmist, as it were, look at it from God's eyes, from heaven's perspective. And the psalmist changed. His language changed. Verse 17. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood the end. Verse 18 says, surely thou didst set them in slippery places. Thou castest them down into destruction. In spite of the apparent success of this man and his kingdom, Ahasuerus, in spite of the progress of the wicked, my dear brother and sister, in this world, there seems to be a general downward spiral, and that's also seen in the world today. You see, for the believer, for you and I, persecution is here and now. It's on earth. It's in this life. But it cannot be compared with, Paul says, the weight of glory that awaits us. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 17 says, for our light affliction, look, our scripture sees it, the struggles that we struggle with, all these difficult circumstances, look what God says about it. This light affliction, which is but for a moment. And your life and my life, it seems to be going on and on and on. God says it's a light affliction. And just for a moment, it worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. So my suggestion is, my encouragement to you is, keep your eye on the goal. Keep your eye on the end. on the final destination, our eternal bliss and blessings and prosperity. Our feast, this was a long feast. Our feast will be greater. Our feast will be longer. Our feast will be more magnificent and more glorious. It will be eternal. What hope is that of the believer? Coming to verse 6 and 7. The focus here is on the beautiful furnishings with which the palace was decorated with. There was nothing more luxurious anywhere in the world at the time. Verse 5 describes the court of the gardens where the feast took place. There's an open space. It's paved with special stones. Verse 5 says, upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble, the beds were upon the flooring were of the most luxurious kinds of stones, emphasizing again the splendor of this place. This magnificent palace, however, burned to the ground some years later. Think of all the wealth. Think of all the splendor, the magnificence. It burned down to the ground according to history. You and I look forward not only to a greater feast, but to a place of everlasting wealth and riches and bliss, unaffected by the moth, unaffected by the fire, unaffected by anything the world can throw at us. What a hope is that of the believer. Verse 7 again confirms the abundance of the gold. The drinking vessels were made of gold. In addition to that, each one different, one from the other. No two vessels were the same. They were individually designed, indicating again the king's extravagant style. Feasting in the Persian courts were very closely associated with drinking and drunkenness, and it implies an ample supply of wine. And so verse 8 says, confirms this, and the drinking was according to the law. None did compel. The ESV says, drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. According to the historian Herodotus, there was a law. Whenever the king drank, everybody had to drink. And when the king stopped drinking, everybody had to stop drinking. This was not the case at this feast. The king has given everyone the option. You can drink as much or as little as you want. What was the outcome? Still a drunken orgy. Drinking was without restraint. Oh, the fickleness of men, following the majority, following those in positions of power and popularity, engaging in acts of wickedness, as we see this drunkenness was leading to. How similar in our times. Not only in terms of drinking, but in many other areas of life. Many people are too weak, and I'm talking about Christians as well, too weak to take a stand for what is right, for what is decent, for what is godly. Ahasuerus is presented as famous, as popular, as powerful, as great. However, just like the Pharaohs, and just like the Nebuchadnezzars, and just like the Caesars, he became a vessel used by God to fulfill his own plans and purposes. In Esther, this man is feared, but he's not seen in every single chapter. On the other hand, we've noticed this morning, God is not seen in this book. There's no direct speaking to God. God is not even heard in this book. And yes, he's found in every single chapter. He's controlling the narrative. He's controlling every single movement. God is in control. He is the hand in the glove of human events. And so unlike the kings and the leaders of this world, our God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, unchangeable, kind and gracious. You can't find a leader like that. You can't find a God like that in this world. Because some gods will be gracious and kind, but they will be weak on the other hand. Some will be weak, but they will be arrogant. And this God, He's got it all. He's got the power. He's got the knowledge. He's got the graciousness. He's got the kindness. And He's got the love. The great feast. But the next section, verse 10 to 18, now leads us to the great problem that occurred at the climax of this great party. The climax of this great feast. If in the first section, we are provided with the context for the story, in this second section, verse 10 to 18, we are introduced to the first conflict in the story. The disagreement between the king and his queen. The problem occurred at the end of the feast, at the climax of the feast, at the height of the feast, when everyone was merry and drunk with wine. Vashti had been summoned to the feast, but she refused to come. We looked at the refusals that marked this book earlier this morning. The word Vashti, the name Vashti, means the best, as well as beautiful women. She enters the story as the host of her own party in verse 9. Persian queens usually were excluded from feasts where drunkenness and immorality and immodest behaviors were commonplace. So she was well within her right to have her own feast for the women. In verse 10 then, on the seventh day, that's the last day of the feast, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Vashti to be brought so that everyone could observe her beauty. What vanity! He offered the guests wine and pleasure for 6 months. And now he's offering them to visually feast their eyes on his wife. Verse 11 says, to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. This is the last day of the feast. It reminds me of John chapter 7, the last day of another feast. John chapter 7 verse 2 speaks of the feast of the tabernacles, compared to the great number of feasts in the Persian Empire. And Esther, this is the only specific mention of the Feast of Tabernacles in the New Testament. But at this feast, a golden vessel was also used in John chapter 7. It was filled with water, not with wine. It was poured out at the front of the altar. This was not a time for feasting in John chapter 7. This was a time for thanksgiving. And on the last day of the feast, when the king Ahasuerus summoned his wife to show her to the men who were drunk and immodest, on the last day of this feast, the Lord Jesus Christ stood up and he spoke. And he gave an invitation. Not a command, an invitation. And this is what he says. It says, in the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried, saying, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. That's for satisfaction. That's for salvation. My dear friend, I wonder whether you've responded to that invitation of Christ. Because that invitation still stands. The invitation, the command of this king in Esther, it's long gone. This one stands forever until the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. And verse 11. He called her to show the people and the princess her beauty because she was fair to look on. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment. He wanted to show off her beauty. Oriental women were generally very modest, and they would cover themselves thoroughly, especially in the presence of men. Persian etiquette gave ladies, and especially the queen, a certain reserve. It was unheard of for those ladies to appear in public unveiled. So for her, she might have felt it was a violation of her dignity, of her modesty. The historian Josephus says that in Persia, strangers were not even allowed to look at the wife of another man. And obviously in this case, at the end of this party of 6 months, men who were as drunk as the king, no self-respecting woman would want to be on display before such a group of people. She would have been submitted to suggestive thoughts, suggestive remarks. Whatever the reason, she refused to obey the king. Instead of encouraging her for her modesty, this proud king, this arrogant king, he felt deeply embarrassed in the eyes of those he showed himself in his highest glory. Pride and arrogance blinded this man. It was really all about himself and his kingdom and his power and his wife and her beauty. But how does it apply to us today? It's no use we have the information and we enjoy the story, but it means nothing to us today. First of all, how does this detail contribute to the story? Why are these details given? Why is it important? Well, Vashti played an important role in God's purposes. Because when she refused, her refusal led to Esther's opportunity in chapter 2. Her demotion led to Esther's promotion. For the Jews to survive, there needed to be a Jewish queen on the throne. That's the only way for the Jews to survive this onslaught. They needed a Jewish queen. Can you see the providence of God? Before the actual problem occurred, God has already started to work. He put plans in place. Someone was needed who would be courageous and strong enough, a woman of convictions that won't care for her life. She says in chapter 4, if I perish, I perish. She was going to work in the same environment that Vashti found herself in. A cutthroat world, working with a king, marrying a king that will burn with anger at any willful woman. So her job wasn't easy. Her life was in danger all of the time. But she was placed there by God. She was placed there by God. Sometimes we wonder why God put us where we are. Why God allows the things in our lives that He does. Why He allows particular circumstances in our lives. Why He put us in the jobs that we are. Sometimes we can't make sense of how I can be a force for God. How I can be of use for God. In my circumstances, in my position. If only I had more power and more authority and more prestige. If only I had more money, I can do so much more. But brother and sister, God has put you where you are for a purpose. Regardless of where you find yourselves, and where we all find ourselves, God has placed us there. Esther didn't know what it was, but God was at work. Somebody said, in all the setbacks of your life, God is plotting for your joy. You think of it as a struggle, as suffering? Yes, in our mind, from the earthly perspective it is. God is plotting for your joy. He wants the best for you. The best for me. Verse 13 to 15. The king now consults his advisors as to what was to be done to the queen. What right did she have to refuse? What audacity refuse this powerful king? In verse 13, he consulted the wise men which knew the times, which means they were skilled in the law, they were legal experts. In a general sense, they were the learned men of the day. It says of them, and next unto him, it refers to the place of the 7 men, the princes of Persia and Media. They occupied the place nearest to him. It is also said of them, they saw the king's face, which means they talked to the king personally. They had freedom of access. That was a rare privilege, as Persian kings were seldom seen by their subjects. So these men were very, very close to the king. He trusted them. It is further said of them, they sat the first in the kingdom. They were personal and trusted advisors with a close relationship to the king. The highest ranked men in the kingdom with access to the king's presence. The king consulted these men. And you can understand, if they were the trusted counselors, they will be consulted. So the king says in verse 15, what shall we do unto Queen Vashti according to the law? Because they were the experts in the law. They would know what to do. Because she had not performed the commandment of the king. And he gave them indirectly the responsibility to decide on his behalf, again showing his weakness, an early demonstration of weak leadership, and it will show more and more as the story unfolds. Verse 16, Memucan, although he's mentioned last of the 7, he seems to be the spokesman of the 7, the leader. And he fabricated a crisis out of nothing, coming up with a proposal that throws the spotlight on their own embarrassment and their own weakness. They decided that Vashti's refusal was not only rebellion against the king, it was a rebellion against all the men and all the princes and all the people in the empire. There was a little bit of truth in there. Their conduct might have been selfish, but it's a very important principle that they've stated here. Isn't it true that the conduct of especially those who are prominent, those who take the lead, those who people look up to, they will influence those under them, those looking up to them. When those in position of leadership and prominence are known to practice sin, others will follow and will be affected. My brother and sister, your conduct and my conduct will affect my brother and my sister and others. So the king was as indecisive as Pilate was many years later. And he allowed others to make a judgment, to decide the outcome. And so a grand plan was born. These 7 counselors came up with a grand plan, and that's what we see in the last section. We've seen this started with a great party. The result of the party was a great problem. And now the problem had to be resolved. They came up with a great plan in verses 19 to 22. Verse 19, the verdict is given. The verdict was given to make an example of Queen Vashti. She was to be removed from her position as queen and not be allowed to come anymore before the king. Someone else had to be chosen in her stead. Verse 19, the last part reads, that Vashti come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give a royal estate unto another that is better than she. The queen lost her position. She lost her prestige as the queen. The omission of queen in relation to Vashti from this point onwards is noteworthy, as the expression another who is better than she anticipates the way the story will develop, the story will unfold. It seems as if the readers are being prepared for the appearance of a new queen. And from this point onwards, Vashti is never called queen any longer, because that title will be that of Esther's. The verdict was also to be according to the laws of the Persians and the Medes in verse 19. The laws of the Persians and the Medes were always unalterable. None could change it. Once the law had been passed, there was nothing anyone could do to change the law. Not even the king was able to change it. And so these men made sure, for Vashti to be deposed, it needs to be made and passed according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, because they will never be able to change it. This aspect of the law becomes significant as the story unfolds, as we discover that the unchanging laws of the Medes and Persians were changed by God. God was in control. He was controlling the narrative. These laws that were impossible to change, God changed the laws. However, it came at a price. When God changed the laws, it came at a price. Vashti paid the price. She was demoted. Haman paid the price. He was executed. The enemies paid the price. They were defeated. Can I draw attention to another law in life that also cannot be changed? Romans speaks of the law. It speaks of the law of sin and death. There's a law that reigns in the heart of man. The law of sin and death. Nothing can change that. No one can change that. It's an unchangeable law. And yet, there was one who was able to change even this law. And that was the same God. He freed us from both the law of sin and death. But again, not without a price. It cost him his son. His son had to die so that we could be freed from the law of sin and death. However, in this case, this time, there was no demotion. Only a promotion to greater glory. He wasn't killed, he laid down his life. He lost nothing, but he rather restored that which he took not away. Through his death, more was gained than ever was lost. Verse 20, the second part of verse 20. Why did they make this decree? Why did they give this outcome? Why did they come up with this plan that Vashti need to be demoted? So that all the wives, halfway through verse 20, so that all the wives shall give to their husbands honor. And this will solve the problem? Of course not. The fact is that the problem existed before the law was passed. Because before the law was passed, Vashti went against the husband. There was no need to pass a law for that. It was already in place. After that, Esther went against the husband as well, against the king, when she went unto him uninvited. Not only against the law, but against the culture as well. You see, nothing has changed in this world. Law after law had been decreed, but things are either the same or worse. How many laws have been passed in New Zealand over the last few years to improve society? But did it? Did it solve society's problems? No, in fact, it compounded the problems that already existed prior to the passing of those laws. With man in control, the Bible says the world will wax worse and worse. It highlights again the positive and the glorious outcome of God's control. And so in verse 22, letters were sent out to all the provinces to publish this decree. Chapter 1 concludes with an interesting statement. It should be published according to the language of every people. The implication is every man in his own house should speak his own native language, because many of them had a lot of foreign wives. And in order to control them, to show his authority over them, they had to learn his language in order to understand his commands and his authority. It was her responsibility. That was a way to keep them under control. This attitude towards women hasn't changed until Christ came into this world. When he arose, he had the choice of appearing to those great apostles, those great disciples. He didn't. He chose to appear to faithful women. He could have appeared to the Apostle John or the great man Peter. He appeared to a woman out of whom 7 devils went out, Mary Magdalene. When Paul started his ministry in Europe for the first time, his first convert was a lady, a woman, Lydia, who later hosted the church in a house. So the Lord Jesus Christ elevated the status of women to the highest degree, while still maintaining the distinction between man and woman. Ephesians chapter 5 says, husbands, to love you, to sacrificially love your wives, as Christ loveth the church. But then the wives, to willingly submit to their husbands, as unto the Lord. You see, there's a responsibility on both. If the husband will sacrificially, like Christ, love his wife, there will be no problem submitting to him. And if the wife willingly submits to the husband, no matter whether he loves her sacrificially or not, it will make it easier for the husband to love her like Christ did. So there is a responsibility on both the man, on the woman, the wife, and the husband. It would have solved the problem in the Persian Empire of chapter 1, if that would have been the case. But we have to conclude. I want you to notice as I close the stark contrast in the way chapter 1 starts and ends. The story, chapter 1, began with the king displaying his glory and his splendor. Now he's trying to recover his humiliation at the end. Can you see who's really in control? God wanted a new queen on the throne, and he simply used the self-obsessed king to put Esther in the position where God could save his people. We'll see this over and over again in the book of Esther, but also in your life and in mine. God is working on our behalf, unseen, unheard, but he's effectively assuring our good. That is the providence, divine providence of God. Chapter 1 commences with a great party. It concludes with a great problem and a great plan, both which left the kingdom, the empire, in a crisis. But it formed the perfect background for God's intervention in every chapter to follow. From here onwards, you'll see in the next few nights, God controls, and God is in charge of everything. His control is seen in all its majesty and in all its beauty. In view of this, I want you to notice the contrast in the Christian life as well. Paul writes to Timothy, chapter 2, 2 Timothy 3 and 13, he says, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse. Things in this world will go from bad to worse, but God will have the last say. Listen to Paul again. 2 Corinthians 4 and 7. But we have this treasure in earthly vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. We are cast down, but not destroyed. During a time when everything seems to be against the believer, I want you, like the psalmist, to look at things from God's view, from heaven's perspective, and allow you to discover God's control and God's providence, just as we see in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 4 verse 35 we read, "And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth," that is God, "according to his will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, none can stay his hand." I close with the words of William Cowper. God moves in a mysterious way. His wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Oh, the control of God, the might of God. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. May the Lord bless us. In his name.